Douglas County Community Access Television presents the Regional Report, issues of interest in a complex world, with Regional Reporter Steve Teshara. And now, with today's program, here's Steve Teshara.
The book is We Survived, At Last I Speak. This book is Leon Malmed's true story of how he and his sister Rochelle survived and finally escaped from the Holocaust in occupied France during World War II. On July 19, 1942, when Leon was only 4.5 years old and his sister 10, their parents were arrested by French police early one morning and turned over to German soldiers. It all happened so fast. Their French neighbors, Henri and Suzanne Ribelou, volunteered to watch the children until they returned. The book is a narrative of love and courage set against a backdrop of tragedy, fear, injustice, prejudice, and the greatest moral outrage of the modern era. Leon, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much.
You get a little choked up because the book is really an emotional journey, and you're still living it today. So your parents were taken from you so suddenly, but I know it was such a pivotal point in your life that you still have vivid memories of it. And you were only 4.5. What was it like?
Indeed, that was my first memory, and my first memory was when I was hanging to my mother's dress. I just didn't want to let him go.
You know, I've read the book. My wife has read the book. We've shared the thoughts we have, the feelings we had. Your parents were such decent people. They were just regular people living their lives. They emigrated from what today is Eastern Poland to France, and they were just raising a family and just living lives in a normal neighborhood, and yet this tremendous atrocity came to them basically because of your Jewish background and Jewish faith. This was the time that many of the French people, unfortunately, after the Nazis had occupied France, were doing the bidding of the Germans. So it wasn't even Germans who came to your home, it was the French police who came. And in the chaos of the moment, your neighbors basically said that they would watch you and your sister until your parents returned. Nobody knew what was going to happen. And that was an extraordinary act. You say in the book that they were courageous and very caring, which they were, but at that moment, no one knew. And yet they made that commitment and they stuck through it for many years. Tell us a little bit about Henri and Suzanne.
Yes, I have often pondered about the fact that they made that commitment. And as time has gone by, I really feel that at the time that they made that commitment, they certainly had no idea what the commitment was for, the dangers that they were coming to live with, and they probably thought it was only for a few days. Mm-hmm. However, later on, this actually the dangers lasted for almost 3 years, and it is amazing, unbelievable that with all the pressures that were put by the French authorities, mm-hmm. as well, of course, as the SS authorities, right. Nazis authorities, that they haven't given up. They had many opportunities to give up, especially the day where we were to be arrested. We were the last, actually, Jews to be arrested in town, and we were able to escape by seconds. At that time, I remember that I was 7 years old. We thought that they would just given us up. The fact that they had prepared our bundle, if we want to call it that way, mm-hmm. and we were ready to go. We expected any time that there would be a knock on the door and the Nazis would come and pick us up, because at that time, in 1944, the Gestapo, the Nazis, the Germans, had taken over the French police.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and they also had pressure from neighbors who thought, because Henri and Suzanne had 2 sons of their own, yes. Marcel and René, and some of the neighbors said, well, we think that you're in danger, your whole family is in danger because you have these 2 young Jewish children with you, but they had made a commitment.
They had made a commitment, they kept the commitments. René was about 21, 22 years old, and Marcel was about 19 at the time. And the neighbors were, their conversation was to worry about the Ribolot family, the four of them. However, they were very concerned because anyone who knew of someone who was hiding an undesirable, such as Jews and underground fighters,
Right.
and people of who were actually hunted by the Nazis, was put in danger. So the whole street was put in danger. Our teachers were put in danger. The parents of our school fellows were put in danger. So there must have been hundreds of people who knew of us, and someone never gave us up. Across the street from us, there was a lady, a single lady, who was entertaining a German officer, pretty much for several years. And we always thought that somehow she would give us up. And maybe she did, maybe she didn't. We'll never know. But it didn't happen. Across the street, on the bottom of our street, there was a farm that was actually owned by a Dutch person. And he was a nice person. However, he would get drunk almost every night with German soldiers when we were to get milk. And my sister and I went together to get the milk, which was about 200 yards away from our home. And we were always concerned to hear the word Juden. We had to cross this big yard before we went to the main building. And on the way out, we expected halt, kommen Sie Juden. So it was just a fear that lasted not only one day, not only a week, not only a month, but years.
Right. And yet, with all of that, in reading the book and also in looking at the whole documentary clip that you lent me, it's amazing that you had a good education and you were able to learn many things, growing garden. I mean, it was such you mentioned the story about the milk. There's such work to just get enough food to eat. And yet, you did have an opportunity to get a good education, to learn from these people as if they were your parents. And you in the end, you turned out to be a fine man. And yet you were really in a very difficult situation. And then, as you say, that you went through this, and the Germans took over for the French. They were increasingly hostile. Atrocities. People were being rounded up. If a German soldier got injured in town, they would summarily round up people and send them off to a camp nearby, and maybe farther, probably exterminate them, kill them, torture them. Just the vilest and foulest evil that one could even begin to imagine. But one day there came, and I guess from time to time you listened on the radio, where finally there was liberation. Of course, there was a lot of bombing and other terrible things. Many people in the town that you lived in were killed in those. But finally, you were looking out of that small window, and what did you see?
In a reference to the education, I call my education, my sister's education, and mine, in dotted line, that out of maybe 200 days, that we probably attended 50 days of education for 3 years. So I believe that it is a good lesson for our young people that it is important to go to school. However, if you miss a day, even if you miss a month, it's no catastrophe. You can catch up, and you can still have, in the end, a good education and good jobs and good opportunities. In reference to the hostages, yes, indeed, Steve, that whenever there was a German who was hurt or killed, they would take 50 people that they would find in the streets or in storage at the camp that was located about half a mile away from our home, and they would just execute them in public, 50 people for every German who was hurt. So in the end of it is that the end of the war, we watched, actually, we heard, and we watched the end of the war from from the basement.
Right.
And we had just a little window that was about the street high, and we were all watching what was happening. And of course, nothing was happening for about a day and a night. And one day at 4 o'clock in the morning, we heard boots actually, and that we saw soldiers, a few soldiers passing by this little window by our cellar, and they just sounded different because the Germans had just a different step and different sound. So we thought they were Americans, we were not too sure. And at that time, we had been told on the radio that when liberation came, never go out in the street because those soldiers would just shoot at anything that moved for their own security and for a very good reason. So at 5 o'clock in the morning, 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, when the daylight appeared, that Papa Henri went out, and yes, they saw the Americans with tanks and so on passing by Rue de Paris, which was about 50 yards away from our building. So that was liberation, and that was
quite a day. And it was
great day.
The town where you lived had a special significance for Hitler because that's where he had to, or where the Germans signed the armistice after World War I. So it seems like he paid particularly vicious attention to your community, even though it was primarily, it sounds like, a community of working class folks who were just trying to, to live their lives and raise their families. So that must have been extra special to have that whole historical significance there erased by the Americans and others coming to liberate you.
Yeah, to Hitler, Compiègne was the shame of Germany, whereby the Nazis actually accused the Jews, and I learned this during my research, for Germany having lost World War I, which is quite interesting because no one knows what this accusation comes from, but he had to blame someone. And before, when the war started, the first thing that was done is that he had the town bombed. Half of the town was destroyed. Almost 1,000 buildings were destroyed at that time. Wow. Then, a few months later, well, maybe almost a year later, when, well, not a year later, actually it was just a few months later, he had whatever was left, he had it destroyed, and he had it burnt, actually, completely to the ground. Then he landed in a small airport, like a Tao airport, and somehow they had this big, I've seen pictures, we lived in a town when this happened, but we didn't see him, of course.
Right.
And he went through the town and paraded to no one, but just to the German soldiers. And he went to the armistice, was called Carrefour de l'Armistice, which is a square in the forest about 10 kilometers away from the center of town, where the first war armistice was signed at the end of World War I in 1918. And that's where apparently he danced for his officers. He was so happy that there was kind of a revenge.
Right. Well, we've gone through the essence of the first part of the story, and we're going to come back in a minute and finish talking about what happened after the war and how Leon and his sister came to the United States, and even how Leon eventually ended up, he's a resident here at South Lake Tahoe. So we're honored to have he and his family a part of our community in that way. And we'll talk a little bit, too, about how Leon came to write the book. We'll be right back after this.
The Regional Report receives support from the Gill Professional Building, Lake Tahoe's most professional business location, 218 Elks Point Road, Round Hill, Zephyr Cove, Nevada. Professional office suites now available. Get information at 775-588-2488 or on the web at gillprofessionalbuilding.com.
We are back with Leon Malmed, and again the book is We Survived, At Last I Speak. So in the first part of the show, Leon, we covered your parents being taken away, the war, finally the liberation from the Americans and the other allies, So now you're returning to a peacetime life in a way, although there were still a lot of tumultuous things that you were going through. I wish we had more time today to cover some of the details, but you actually had a second separation from Suzanne and Henri, which folks can read about in the book. That was, again, you're still pretty young. That was very traumatic, I think. But eventually you became a young man, and your sister and yourself grew up, and she eventually came to America, to the East Coast, right? A few years later, you came over, and I think you established yourselves in the New York area and thereabouts, doing a lot of really good work. When you and Patricia invited me over for lunch at your home that day, you told a great story about your career and how you rose in mechanical engineering and lots of sort of machinery and development, but then ultimately in software and data storage. So quite a story, which isn't in the book, but is a great story as well. But eventually you came to California, and then there's a Tahoe piece.
That's right, yes. Well, what you say is not in a book, maybe will be my next book.
Very good, very good.
Yes, so we came, well, I arrived in this country in 1964, in February of 1964, after a tumultuous transatlantic crossing. And in 1982, I was hired actually by a Silicon Valley company. The name of the company is Quantum, manufacturing of disk drives. And then I spent the last 30 years until I retired in disk storage, working in Silicon Valley. It has been a fantastic experience to me. So I went from hardware, electronics to semiconductors. And the last company I was associated with is called SanDisk. That's a company that manufactures little flash memory cards. That's just celebrated about a month ago its 25th anniversary.
Wow.
And I was lucky enough to work in Silicon Valley with very good people at a time where companies were flourishing, technology was flourishing, and some of the greatest steps of progress in electronics, I believe, were made. It is the experience that I have encountered in my early life have helped me tremendously in my career. Life is full of issues, full of problems that you have to deal with and resolve on a daily basis, if not on an hourly basis. And of course, we have to make sure that we understand what kind of priorities that we need to assign. But the most important priority is happiness, not only happiness for oneself, but happiness that we share with other people, and bringing the people to really to your level of happiness, and bringing the level of problems to where they should be at a much lower level. And it is probably the experience that I have endured after the war, when I was taken away from the people I loved very much, and I was brought to to an uncle and aunt whom I did not know in the first place. And I was able eventually to separate from these people after 4 years of battling. And I did this on my own because my sister had been sent 2 years prior to America against her will. Today, it's very difficult to think that we can be sent to America against your will, but in those days, she simply did not want to separate from me. And it took 13 years before I saw her again, wow, before I heard her voice. So 2 years after that I was able actually to, and I was 12 years old, to go back to the people who loved me and whom I loved, which was the Ribolo family. So it has been an enduring, lifelong example of what one can do, of what I could do. And I use it to this day, that in anything that we do.
you've spoken now with many people. Well, first let's go back to, you had this story. It took you a long time to even be able to talk about what had happened.
Yes.
And so you got to that point, and then I guess a number of people urged you to think about writing a book. Everybody involved gets older. It would be a terrible story to lose. There's a lot of lessons to be learned, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, it's one thing to have it in your mind. It's another thing to get it out on paper. And you
Yes.
did write it in French first, yes,
Yes.
and then English. But I was struck in the book, Leon. You're a very good speaker, but a writer needs to find their voice, and you found a wonderful voice here. You tell a very compelling story, rich with details, even though it was a long time ago. And it's written in a style that's very easy to read and very moving. So how did you develop your voice to tell the story?
When I lived in France between the end of the war and until I left, actually, the Papa and Maman Riboulot, when I went to the armed forces, it was in the French Air Force,
Mm-hmm.
that we never talked about those times. And no one could talk about it for reasons that are still actually mysterious to me. But it was mostly, to me, it was emotional. I simply could not talk about it. As you see, today, after all these years, 70 years have passed, it's still difficult to keep myself from breaking down. So then, of course, that I went to study mechanical engineering, graduated, and so on, came to the States, and I did hold good positions, and I had to write speeches. So I did write speeches for work, but writing a speech of about 6 to 8 pages and writing a book of over 200 pages, 232 pages to be exact, is a different story. So I then was encouraged by my sister, who lives in New York. She's 81 years old, and she's just in great shape. She's a dancer, actually, loves dancing. And she encouraged me to talk to the public, to churches, to synagogues, to schools about our history. And I did, and to do that, I wrote about 8-10 pages. Then every time that I spoke and that someone asked me, did you write a book? Did you write a book? So eventually I put about 12 pages. Once I was with my sister, I said, well, let's sit down and see what we remember. So I was able to write 12 pages. And the click, I was on. I came back from New York home, and in Tao, actually, and I wrote 75 pages in English because I felt my English was a little bit better, although maybe it doesn't sound like it.
I think it's
it
very
was a little
good.
bit better than my French. Then someone in France heard that I was writing a book, and the publisher called me and said, well, we would like to publish your book, but it has to be in French. We'll give you 2 years to write it. You're not going to make any money, but it's not going to cost you anything. So I said, that's fine. No, I'm not doing this to make money. I'm just doing this to make sure that the world does not forget, make sure that the world knows about it. I started to write, and my French actually came back, and it was good. I had about 4 people actually do the editing, but essentially the story came very, very nicely, and the book was quite successful in French. Then I hired someone to do the translation, and I just didn't like the translation at all. It simply was not me, it was not my emotions, it was not my words, and eventually after about 3 to 6 months working on trying to make it better, I deleted all of it.
Wow.
I shredded all the papers I had. I said, I don't want to be tempted to look at it, and I started to write it from scratch. And I felt that it had to be rewritten for the American reader and not to be a translation. So it took me 2 years to do that.
Wow.
And I was very fortunate that very quickly a gentleman by the name of Paul Royster from Zia Books, who is affiliated with the University of Nebraska, despite the fact that he had a very early vision, encouraged me said, yes, we will publish your book. So after many revisions and after many revisions, we were able to publish the book, and that's what it is. I've had also about 4 or 5 people doing some editing, but essentially that's the way it is. And it seemed that it has been very successful. I have had so many comments and reviews and testimonials that it's just overwhelming.
And you have a lot, you obviously did a tremendous amount of research, because there's details in the book that you couldn't know then.
Yes.
You know, about what happened, who was transported out of the area. You know, eventually we learned that your parents had been killed.
Right.
And lots of other members of your family, and people that you knew and loved. And so you obviously did a tremendous amount of research on it. And now you're speaking, you're getting a lot of opportunities to share the story. And what do people find, if there is 1 or 2 things that you think they find most compelling, what would they be?
Everyone said, thank you for telling the story. Thank you for coming out and just making sure that people know. The compelling also is for young people to learn that we all have problems, and there is always a solution to the problems. The fact that Patricia, my wife, and I went to Auschwitz, to Majdanek, and to several of the camps in Poland. And while I was there, we saw a lot of young people. And I believe that for people to have a happy life or happier life, they should be going to those camps and understand what went on there. And some people who were doctors, who were engineers, who were technicians, who were teachers, went through, and many of them and their families came out even stronger.
You know, there's one particular, there's so many lines in the book that really spoke to me very directly. One that I thought was particularly striking and meaningful, about, in a way, sums up the experience, and that is the line that you wrote that said, "I have avoided the bitterness that could have destroyed me."
Yes.
So, Leon,
Yes.
thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
And thank you for telling your story.
Thank you very much.
We'll see you in a future edition on the Regional Report here on Douglas County Community Access Television.
Thank you.
You've been watching the Regional Report with Regional Reporter Steve Teshara. Studio location provided by the Gill Professional Building, 218 Elks Point Road, Round Hill, Zephyr Cove, Lake Tahoe. Graphic design and titles by Charter Advertising Design. Announcer Ed Miller, Wild West Communications. Production by Lloyd Higuera and Douglas County Community Access Television.